When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time over at my grandparents' house. Both my parents were forced to travel often for their jobs, so I was dropped off at the grandparents' house pretty often. It wasn't as bad as some kids would expect. These were the days of dial-up internet, so being upset about not having Wi-Fi was non-existent. Kids, like myself, played outside during those times. Shocking, I know. This particular story takes place when I was about 9 years old. It was right around Christmas time, and they had allowed me to open one present early, without my parents knowing, of course. I remember what it was and how I felt as well. It was a brand new pair of binoculars. I was a big fan of bird watching as a kid and still am today, but of course I had more time back then. My granddad looked at me and said, "I'm going to let you go out into the woods to look for all the critters, but be sure not to go past the creek." Being 9, this kind of went in one ear and out the other. I agreed and headed out. The forest behind my granddad's house was massive and he owned it all. I think my dad told me at one point that it was 9 or so acres. I, as a kid, told myself that I had explored it all. Funny how your imagination can run wild like that. Well, this day in particular, my mind wasn't running rampant. What I saw was real, and I knew it judging by my grandparents' reaction. I'd been in the forest for a good 10 minutes at this point, just walking as straight as I could, looking for any of the critters that ran around out there. I saw a handful of cardinals and chickadees, but nothing super spectacular. Then I ran across the creek. It was completely frozen over, of course, but my mind still wondered about trying to think of what could be on the other side. Why wasn't I allowed over there? Of course it was for safety reasons. Once you're past the creek a little ways, the house is no longer within seeing or shouting distance. In my mind, however, it was the only place I'd see what I wanted to. I wanted to see a bird I hadn't seen, the less common ones. I looked back at the house a few times, contemplating my decision, and had decided not to go over the threshold and disobey my granddad, but then I heard something on the other side. It was a man's voice. It wasn't scary, I remember. It was warm and inviting, kind of like a good audiobook. I grabbed my attention and, before I knew it, jumped the creek and headed deeper into the woods. I didn't hear that voice again for quite some time, and I wasn't seeing any new birds, so I was beginning to think this was a waste of time. I decided to take one more look into the binoculars, do a quick 360, and then head back. The sun was starting to go down, and I knew if I was out here much longer, I'd get into trouble. I pulled the binoculars to my eyes and took one last look, and I saw it. It wasn't what I was looking for. It was a man. He was tall and wore a fine black suit. He even had a briefcase with him. Judging by how strong the binoculars were, he could have been a little less than half a mile away. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there. The longer I looked, the more apparent of how wrong this was came over me. Why would someone in a suit carrying a briefcase be hanging out in the woods in the middle of December? I was so focused I didn't hear my granddad approaching. Soon he snatched me up and carried me all the way back to his house, scolding me the entire way. Back home, I sat on the couch and he questioned about what I could have seen that made me disobey him. Through my sniffling and eye-rubbing, I could only say, I heard a man out there. His demeanor changed completely, and I remember hearing my grandpa gasp a little bit. He crouched down beside me and said, "What did he say?" "He just said, 'Hey,' and then he was gone. I didn't see him until I crossed the creek." Nearly whispering, he responded, "What did he look like?" "He had a suit and a briefcase. Are you going to tell my mom?" He looked up at my grandmother and then back at me. No, we're not, kiddo. Don't worry, we're not mad. We were just worried about you." It wasn't until I was much older that I figured out what I saw in those woods. I was 18 and my granddad was in bad health. He wasn't set to pass anytime soon, mind you, but he was just very sick. We were visiting in the hospital, and when my parents left to get some food, he told me all about what that man was. Apparently there used to be a cemetery on that land before it became overgrown with trees and vines. That man was a spirit everyone referred to as the Undertaker. According to my granddad, he was a businessman, hence the briefcase, but suffered a heart attack during his wife's funeral. Nowadays he roams the woods, looking for the grave of his wife. It was a heartbreaking tale. The reason he was so worried about me at the time is because it said that if you're caught by the undertaker, he'll curse you. You'll fall gravely ill and eventually pass away from cardiac arrest like him. I'm not sure how much I believe that story, but I will say that I'm glad he never looked at me. His back was facing me the entire time. My grandma did eventually pass away, not cardiac arrest if you're curious, but I've kept the legend strong. I tell everyone I know about it, and if I ever run across kids in that area while visiting the old house, I make sure to tell them, never go past the creek. The following happened when I was on a school French history trip to France and Belgium back in 2014, which incidentally was the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I. However, the paranormal events which occurred in this short trip had nothing to do with the many mass grave sites and historical locations we visited. In fact, they all occurred in the first, basic and cheap hotel we stayed in for the first 2 nights. The hotel, which I have since forgotten the name of, was bordering on a hostel. It was 6 of us to a room and 3 bunk beds, and I was sharing one with my closest friends. I also knew the other boys fairly well. I remember that on the first day we had been awake for well over 24 hours, so upon arriving at the hotel we didn't pay much attention to how it looked. However, we found it surprisingly hard to get to sleep immediately. The first strange occurrence happened while everyone was casually chatting as we lay in bed, probably at around 11 at night. Each bottom bunk had a light underneath it, and they were all controlled from one central wall switch over by the door. I should mention that we had all these lights off as we were meant to be asleep. However, in the middle of our conversation, one of the lights suddenly turned on. It stopped our conversation dead, and we were all slightly confused. This happened several more times with lights going on and off under the bunks while the wall switch didn't move. Everyone was getting visibly spooked at this point. However, one of the boys had found a second switch beside his bed, and we soon realized that every bunk had these to control the 3 lights. With everyone relaxed again, our 14-year-old imaginations calmed down significantly, and everyone began to nod off one by one. Later in the night, at what I estimate was about 1 in the morning, I was still half awake. I have always been a very light sleeper. I was listening to the deep breathing of everyone in the room when I heard an audible click. I turned around and saw the light to the walk-in shower was on. I assumed that someone had walked in to play a prank, but after quickly scanning my eyes about the room, I could see that everyone was in bed. I was confused, but not frightened yet. Shortly after the shower turned on seemingly by itself, I again turned over to face the walk-in shower. Sure enough, through the crack in the door I could see the shower water running. I turned away quickly and lay there for hours, unnerved before falling asleep. The next morning was busy, visiting several historical sites, and it wasn't until lunchtime in a cafe that a few of us brought up the night before. Several others testified to being awake when the light and shower turned on. We were all slightly unnerved, but it wasn't until the next night that things really kicked off. On the second night, everyone fell asleep very quickly, but as per usual, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake slightly nervous, and the main light of the room went on and off at intervals of around 10 minutes for around an hour. Then, at around 2 in the morning, I heard a huge crash and looked around to see that the shower door had swung open, completely hitting the wall. The light was on and shower running. I was terrified. I turned to face the wall and didn't open my eyes till the next morning. The next day we moved to a different hotel, and the subject of the hotel being haunted was only brought up once more during the trip. Although this is one of the smaller experiences I've had regarding the paranormal, it sticks with me due to how unexpected it was. We found out that the original owner of the hotel had died from cancer, but I saw no evidence or reason that whatever caused the disturbance was her ghost or spirit. It is an experience that will always stick with me as being strange and spooky.